My name is Maria Thomas. I'm the curator of plants here at the City of Albuquerque Biopark. I'm also an adjunct professor with the University of New Mexico. I teach the Plant Materials 2 class. So plants are my passion. I seem to have made a fabulous career out of it, and I hope that through the course of this webinar today, I can kind of give you some of that passion to take with you. So my background is I grew up here in New Mexico. I lived up in northern New Mexico and in the shortgrass prairies of eastern New Mexico. So probably being outdoors is the way that I reconcile just about everything in life. And I've kind of worked with that and made a career out of it. But it is my past and my history and my experience with being out in the New Mexico environments, which I do try to bring into my work.
Maria, I hate to interrupt, but there's a little pop-up that's hiding some of the information on your slides. Any chance you could click the hide button on that? There you go. Great. Thank you.
There we go. Okay, great. So yeah, like I said, I do get a lot of my design inspiration from nature. I feel like if we can just kind of observe these natural spaces around us and look at what's going on within them, we can bring that into our work and we build stronger, more resilient communities as a result. And so in doing that, here at the Biopark, I worked with the designer for the Sasebo Japanese garden to try to create more desert adapted plant palette for this garden. And that's kind of where I started my career at the Biopark. I do have to say this is not a low water use garden, but we receive over 1 million visitors a year. So we try to balance the use of water for this garden for the fact that it has this strong connection to the public, and it serves a purpose for enjoyment and cultural understanding on a very broad scale. Some of the plants that you see in the slide here, they're front and center, that beautiful dark bark and the nice orange leaves. That's a sawleaf zelkova. And that's one we'll talk a little bit about later as far as what our changing climate and drought has been doing with this tree. Another one of my favorite projects here at the Biopark was the High Desert Rose Garden. I love this project so much because I was allowed to kind of reimagine what a rose garden could look like. So I went to college at the University of Oregon, and very formal rose gardens there. Portland Rose Garden is world renowned. Basically, it's row after row after row of rows and more rows with a little bit of mulch in between. And so when I was given the task to design this garden, I really wanted to create a more ecologically sound space where you could show how to grow roses in arid climates in a sustainable way. A lot of what you see here is through using these green mulches as ground covers and just creating a lot of biodiversity with the different plants that you see in the photos. Also, what I do here, when we started building the Bugarium about, I think it was 8 years ago at this point, really looking closely at the relationships between pollinators and our native plants and being able to understand what was going on and support those ecosystems. So you see that in my work as well. And then working with all of the species experts and specialists through our state for native plant conservation, understanding these rare plants and how they exist in our state and how we can support them through programming, seed banking, and restoration practices. Here's a few of them that we work with at the Biopark. So along the lines of conservation and why this matters is we know that New Mexico is getting hotter and drier. You know, there's been this constant increase in summer temperatures, more days above 90 and even 100 degrees. And we look at what Elephant Butte looked like, you know, in the 90s versus the early 2000s, and it is significantly shrunken. So this last kind of depressing map of New Mexico is the projected suitability for inhabitability by 2030, which doesn't look great for our state. I think much like Phoenix, how they're running out of water, if we don't try to make more sustainable choices about how we landscape our urban environments, we can significantly impact this. Part of that increasing temperature is our new USDA climate designation of zone 8A, potentially 7B, depending on where in Albuquerque you live. I'm not really excited about that designation because I think due to things like wind chill, inconsistent temperature swings, particularly in the winter, water availability, and things that are less obvious, but soil pH, these things make us not exactly the same climate zone as Athens, Georgia, as this USDA designation might indicate. Here's some examples of what I've seen here at the Botanic Garden. So the first one is Japanese privet, Ligustrum japonicum. And I don't know if you can see that in your monitors, but there's quite a bit of pocking on the leaf surface. And so this is something, it's a zone 6 plant. It should be great here. But what happens is those frigid spring winds that we have kind of hit that plant just as it's starting to, come into its own out of its evergreen state of dormancy. And it creates all that pocking on the plant. What we have in the middle there is that Zecova, that sawleaf Zecova, that beautiful tree that I showed you a few slides back. As you look closely at the bark, you can see those long linear fractures along the trunk. I'd like to say that this is isolated to just that one tree, but in fact, it is on all of the sawleaf Zecova in the Japanese garden. When we started this garden about 20 years ago, we thought this would be a great climate-ready tree. It's related to elms, but it's not as aggressive as maybe a Siberian elm might be, as the reseeding potential, has that beautiful fall color. It's fairly drought tolerant, and it's a fairly fast growing shade tree. What we didn't understand about it was these fluctuating winter temperatures we have. They cause the warm parts of winter, cause the sap to flow. And then like we got that first week of January this year, it goes from reasonably cool winter temperature to just frigid 6 degrees for a week. And what happens there is you had those saps flowing through the bark of the tree, and then it froze suddenly, and you get that frost fracture. So this was something I myself was completely unaware of. We were fortunate to have a beer and botanic garden tour with the International Society of Arboriculture annual conference last year, and they were able to kind of highlight what was going on with this tree and help us determine that that's what was going on. So a little bit disappointing, considering that these fluctuating temperatures that we see are part of why we call New Mexico an extreme climate. And then the last one is a Rosa rugosa. Again, a really great choice for about 20 years ago in our Japanese garden. But you can see what our extreme temperature and soil pH has done to this plant. So not necessarily suitable for our climate. So how do we get from there to here? And simply put, by understanding the natural processes that surround us to create resiliency in our built landscapes. So these first two photos of our natural landscapes, how do we turn something like that is completely sustainable on its own with no supplemental help from us to one or the other of those landscapes on the right? So the top one in my mind is a landscape from the team of High Country Gardens, and I prefer to think of Albuquerque looking like that as opposed to the bottom. The bottom is often noted to be what is xeriscape. A lot of people quite jokingly call it xeroscape, which is more accurate. The problem I have with this type of landscape is even though it's really easy to keep clean with the little pesticides, herbicides, and whatnot, it really does nothing to prevent the heat island effect that our city suffers from increasing temperatures. And it does nothing toward habitat connectivity for the critical pollinators that have to survive in our urban environments. So to start with the basics, soil's a living system. I love this beautiful diagram of desert plants and all the things that are happening in the soil beneath us. So decomposition, nutrient cycling, soil structure, disease suppression, phytohormone production. That's a big one for me. Even symbiotic relationships. So what's going on with all of the microorganisms and the plants themselves, salinity regulation, and carbon sequestration. So all of this depends on ambient temperature, which, as we see in all of these studies, climate change studies, that is changing drastically in our desert environment. Aridity affects that. Compaction, so not just in a natural desert setting, but also, for example, in new construction. So as we build our urban environments and we're compacting those soils to build buildings on top, what happens to the soil around them that we put in our urban landscapes? And the availability of nutrients and organic matter, also microorganisms. So how best do we support soil health? Well, here's a picture of what ideal soil is. That photo on the left is by Soilutions, which is a great place to get any of your organic materials. They have a very clean product that we use here. And I've had negative experiences with other suppliers with things like soil sterilants in their products, and that affects everything negatively. So Soilutions is a good trusted place to get that type of product. Sorry to be pitching, but I am using their photo, so I might as well give them a good nod. Anyway, ideal soil is nutrient and oxygen rich, it's well draining, and it has a neutral or slightly acidic pH. So this other photo on the right is sandy, which is kind of closer to what we have, loamy, nice in the middle, and clay. So ideally, it's that pot in the middle is what you want for optimal plant health and growing. This is what we have. So on the right, you see this wonderful profile of desert soils. As you look at that profile, what you're seeing is very low in organic matter, which also means that it's low in moisture retention. So whatever moisture it does get tends to drain off or evaporate quickly because there's nothing in that particulate to hold that moisture. High pH or alkaline, also related to that are the high concentrations of salts, gypsum, and calcium, which is why you see really unique plants like this gypsum buckwheat and this prickly poppy down at the bottom. So these are two rare plants in New Mexico that are critically imperiled as well. And it's because of that unique soil structure that these plants exist in our desert. The other thing that you see in these desert soils is this subsurface clay or calcium deposit. It accumulates and it creates one, caliche, and two, a desert pavement, which is when you see all those big pebbles percolating to the top. So those conditions really not ideal in planting things like, say, an orchard. So what do you do then? Plant native. I know many of you in the audience probably agree that, but if there's other things on your agenda, like having a vegetable garden or an orchard, then you certainly have to do some mediation to get there. And again, ideal soil. So how do we create that? By improving soil structure, nutrients, and water retention in these soils. So we know that organic matter is essential. So how do we get that into our soils? This image on the top is kind of this hugelkultur idea where it's basically direct composting. So instead of creating a compost area that you then add into your beds, you're doing this kind of layering of organic materials to build that soil profile naturally and over time. Something very similar that quite a few of the best landscape architects in this city are doing is creating these soil sponges. So for me, it's kind of our desert adaptation. You see in the top photo, the hugelkultur is this kind of nice mound where everything's growing. That might be great in Germany where they have plenty of water, but in the desert, we know that to optimize water capture, we want it to go down and hold more in a bowl, like a waffle garden, for example. So what you see here on the bottom is all the different organic material that you may just recycle, throw in the trash. Maybe it ends up in compost if you're big composters. And it's just being inserted back into the ground. So in this example on the far right bottom, it's a long trench-like structure. And what that does is that helps capture that moisture and nutrients, and it creates a better microecology back into that soil. So why is microecology important? They play a vital role in soil health and ecosystem function. We know that they fix nitrogen. We know that the microbes help water and nutrient uptake, even in arid soils. There's been several studies in Arizona, Israel, and Iran on microbiologies of desert soils. So they do exist. They look very different from like what you might see in Portland, Oregon, but they're there. So what I think is really cool is these two photos on the left. One is Trifolium nanum, which is an alpine clover. So that's up at Alpine Heights, above tree line. And then down here you have the Chihuahua scurf pea, which is a desert legume, and that's down from the boot heel of southern New Mexico. So you have these great, wonderful nitrogen fixers on a desert scale. So it's very subtle, but it is happening. And how do we support that? First thing is by implementing integrated pest management. One thing we know is that herbicides and pesticides impact soil microbial communities, period. Not a lot needs to be said beyond that. Except maybe that when you mix them, it gets even worse and more complicated. So you really have to think about what you're adding into the soil and around the soil, because it is not an isolated thing. The entire system, when you're spraying your weeds or weed and grass killer, that's one of my favorite ones, because weed and grass killer, that's a very clean statement. It kills weeds, it kills grass. Well, that means it kills anything and everything, including your trees. So what I always say is use the least toxic method first. Mechanical removal is very important when you can. I know it's a little more work, and you can do things for pests, including natural deterrents and using predator and trap crops when possible. So this photo on the left is Society garlic. It's what we have planted all over our high desert rose garden. We've also done some Millennium Alliums or onion bulbs, big ornamentals. What's great about those is they're wonderful for pollinators, as you can see in the photo, and they also deter pests. So I got this idea from, this is me kind of nerding out on plants, watching a PBS special on the Queen's Rose Garden. And they actually grow garlic specifically for the purpose of creating their own organic garlic spray for the Queen's Rose Garden. So I don't have an army of garden staff to grow garlic and produce the spray. So what we do is we integrate these plants into the beds. And I do have to say that they work on anything from aphids to porcupine. We have a lot of porcupine here at the Botanic Garden. The roses that aren't surrounded by garlic are chewed down because it's like just a little buffet salad bowl for them. Our roses that have these integrated into the planting beds do not have that same effect. That garlic barrier, that's what we use here. We also control mosquitoes with that. Some of you might be saying now, I've been to the garden, there's a lot of mosquitoes. It's not as bad as it could be, considering we are so close to the Rio Grande Bosque, but it's quite effective. And everything smells like lasagna later, so that's great too. The other thing is these BT products. I want to put out a little bit of caution here. There's something like this bagworm that you see hanging off this juniper. We do use BT to target spray the bagworm when we have big outbreaks. If we see a little bit of damage, then we say, well, that's acceptable. We try to mechanically remove them when we can, or we just accept that there is a level of damage that is going to happen. If we see an infestation, will target spray that specific plant. Because the one thing you have to understand about BT, whether you're using it for bagworms or codling moth in your orchards, it targets all Lepidoptera larvae, which is butterfly caterpillars as well. So knowing when the pest is going to be active and spraying during that time period and that affected plant only are ways that you can work to create a more sustainable pest management system in your landscapes. Okay, so with that, let's move on to water. As we all know, it's required for all essential functions of life, including plant life. So basically, here's a very easy diagram. When people always ask me, how much should I water? There's just no easy answer to that. So depending on what kind of soil you have, if you're here down in the valley, you may be lucky to have kind of a clay loam mix. Your watering requirements are going to be very different than if you're up on the West Mesa and it's all sand and that desert pavement. The other thing that we have to consider is caliche pan layers. So water may permeate down to the first little bit of topsoil because that's real sandy and well draining, but then it hits that caliche pan and it just accumulates from there. It has nowhere to drain. So there's diverse conditions all over Albuquerque. You basically need to just pay attention to what's going on to that area you're watering. Is the saturation well? You know, you always hear about the drip line of plants. You would follow that requirement for this as well. So just check that area, see how fast it's drying out, look at the overall health of the plant and determine if how much water you're applying is accurate. I always like to throw this slide out, my beware of these fancy products. So when people ask about irrigation and what type of irrigation is best, again, it's really going to depend on what you're trying to grow, how many plants you have, and what that soil type is like. But what I always say is be cautious of new fancy things, small parts. These mat covers, this top right photo with the two guys raking. So that actually is a moisture blanket. And so it's basically a drip line in a blanket. And I'm just looking at that and it's recommended for flower beds and it's recommended for sod. And I look at that and I think, you know, maybe I'm not understanding the application, but how are you going to aerate a lawn if you throw that down? Or how are you going to weed once the weeds get through that into the ground as they're likely to do, and then you start pulling that up with your weeds? So I am wary of any of these kind of fancy special products. The bottom left, I love this. So these are little in-ground tree bubblers, and they have these like perforated tubes the whole way down, which the water is supposed to seep into and leach out into the soil. So in theory, that's great, but they've kind of put the problem right there with the solution. So you see all those roots and you see all those perforations. And if there's one thing I've learned about irrigation in these 20 plus years being here at the biopark, it's amazing what roots can do to irrigation. So right there, I think you're just buying a problem and you're spending a lot of time installing it into the ground to create a bigger problem later. So what I always say is when designing irrigation systems, think simple and elegant. Basic is best when you're putting anything under the ground. We use a lot of these shrub bubblers on the left because they're very easy to install and they're very easy to maintain. If we do sprays, we've been trying to convert to these rotors. And why I like these is because it's a steady stream of water. It's a little heavier than like your misting sprays, like a standard lawn pop-up. These can be used for lawns just as well. But what I like about them is because the stream of water is heavier, it doesn't get blown as bad and it doesn't evaporate as quickly. So then we can move on to weed barrier and landscape fabric. So top photo, you can kind of see where I'm going to head already. Restricts water permeability, it restricts airflow, it restricts nutrient absorption. So all those things that we talked about needing to create healthy soils, this is preventing. It may prevent weeds, at least for a little time, but pretty soon those weeds are going to root right into it, and then you're going to be pulling it up with the weeds. It increases soil temperatures. That's another thing too. I mean, imagine this nice kind of thick, heavy synthetic fabric and then throw about 6 inches of rock on top of that. Think about how hot that soil is getting. You've created a nice little microclimate there. And it just completely eliminates any of the natural processes. It leads to soil sterilization, and compaction can also become an issue. People think, okay, so what about cardboard? I hear it decays over time. I did a permaculture project many, many years ago up in Los Alamos. The cardboard had been under the mulch in a fairly wet environment. Los Alamos gets a lot of snow in the winter. They get a lot of rain in the summer. So it had been under there for about 5 years, and it had hardly at all degraded. Why? Potentially. So Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott has a wonderful kind of blog on cardboard mulch and any type of mulch like that, and why it's, in her words, not mine, batshit crazy, which I love that. Contains microplastics and other toxins that'll just leach into your soil and food. In fact, like she did some research, she found some research on cardboard being used in chicken nests for egg laying. And they discovered that the toxins from the cardboard were actually found in the chicken meat themselves and in the eggs themselves as well. So just think about throwing that down and then planting some vegetables on it. And also, you know, most importantly for the desert, it's actually chemically engineered to repel water. So you're not doing all of that soil we're trying to build that great biology, microbiology up in. We're not doing it any favors when we're throwing a nice cardboard mulch. It feels good because it's not plastic mulch and it's not petrochemical, you know, weed barrier, anything like that, but it's not any better in the long run. So we just really need to start rethinking how we use weed barriers, mulches, all of the above. I think we're kind of seeing a trend in the landscape industry to go back to organic mulches as much as possible, like forest mulch and even the pecan mulch. It breaks down over time. It does tend to repel water a little because pecan shells, the outer coatings are very waxy, so you get some of that in there too. But it's much better than any sort of synthetic alternative. And also with gravel, one of my favorite landscape architects in this town, we'll keep her anonymous, but she has said, gravel in your yard is basically taking somebody else's mountain and moving it to your yard. So just remember to be mindful about how we use it, because it is a mountain and it did come from somewhere. But what I like to look at as kind of a way to use this is this wonderful photo that I found on a hike that I took on a hike recently. And so you can see the gravel sizes. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 gravel sizes there, 5, maybe even. And I think that mimicking the way that gravel naturally occurs in our environment, and that might take a little bit of like going out and seeing what's in your own backyard or beyond your own backyard slightly, but then you create a space where some of these plants can actually naturalize. And you all might be thinking like, well, I like that tidy look. I want that clean look in my yard. But I think you can achieve that without it looking weedy or rangy. I love this photo on the right because you have this like big rock, and it's kind of the nursery rock where it's like capturing moisture. And that's exactly where that Helomeris is like seeded out and is growing. It's found a little pocket of moisture under that rock. And then you have all of these other little kind of rock beds where it can drop its seed and then it can naturalize in the landscape. And this is kind of my opinion of what the best type of mulch is living mulch. So this is something we did in the High Desert Rose Garden, where we planted underneath all of the roses some nice ground covers. Excuse me, we did a Santa Fe phlox, and it is just beautiful. It's blooms in the spring before the roses have done anything. They're kind of just nice kind of architectural twigs at that point in spring, and then it's just this carpet of blue, and then it's this nice cooling green in the summer that the other perennials can grow up in amongst. And then in the winter, it's a nice kind of little evergreen carpet that insulates the soil and keeps it warm. That insulation also is effective in the summer as well. So I just had somebody come into the garden last week and said, how are your roses even blooming this time of year still? And I've had a couple of other people make that comment prior years in the past. So I know this isn't a one-off. And I truly believe it is because of this nice living mulch that we've planted under these plants that helps cool the soil. It helps slow evaporation. And then in the winter, conversely, it helps things from freezing. It keeps that ground temperature just a little bit warmer. So that kind of brings me to the next part of the presentation that leads up to plant adaptations and arid environments. And I have to say that I think it was about 2 years ago, I saw this, I want to say, life-changing slide presentation by Joseph Kleinkopf at the Native Plant Society of New Mexico meeting. And the reason why, I mean, I call it life-changing, but it was pretty significant, is because this was on all of the alpine plants of New Mexico. And as he's showing slides of all these alpine plants, I'm looking at some of the traits and characteristics that these plants have to survive in the extreme climate of above 11,000 feet, above tree line, and what they're doing to survive. And you can see they're pretty delicate looking. And so what characteristics they share with our arid desert plants. And so that gave me an idea of like how to start teaching about plant adaptations and plant selection. Because one thing that I always come into contact with is people at the Botanic Garden, or even now the students that I work with, saying, you know, what plants? How do you know what plants? You know, and instead of trying to memorize a list, learning to look at plants, the traits they have, and what that means for our environment. So one of the first ones is, you know, you all have seen this, is reduced leaf surface. It functions to reduce water loss through evaporation and transpiration. It conserves energy, and it reduces the plant exposure to sun and wind. And if there is an extreme drought and you get a little dieback, it's easier to replace a few little needles than a giant, big, heart-shaped leaf, for example. So here's some real quick examples that you all are probably familiar with. Rosemary, pinyon pine, and pine leaf penstemon. So they all exhibit that reduced leaf surface, and that's an adaptation that serves them well in the desert. Here's some other examples of perennials and shrubs, also with reduced leaf surface. So here's that Santa Fe phlox on this bottom left. You can see that it has that nice needle-like foliage. What I also like is you can kind of see that low mounding form, and it's that mounding form that helps with that cooling effect in the summer and that ground cover. It works to shade the plant without choking it out. This Dahlia purpurea, which is one of our desert legumes. So not only does it have this great characteristic of adaptation with that reduced leaf, but it also helps fix nitrogen in the desert. It also has a very deep taproot, which I'll touch on a little bit later as well. And then here, this Cistus purpureus, this is a Mediterranean native, but you can see that it has actually several traits that make it adapted to our arid climate. But what we're looking at now is that nice fine foliage and just those beautiful pink flowers. So desert adapted doesn't necessarily have to mean sparse. The one thing about these Mediterranean plants is they do experience a little bit of a challenge with our fluctuating winters. So this is Cistus is hardy to zone 7. However, when we have a nice mild stretch where it's kind of just doing its evergreen thing, and then we get this sudden drop in temperature like we did last January, it can really create some dieback and shock on some of these Mediterranean plants. So in this instance, finding a nice, warm, protected microclimate for some of these plants is very important as well. And that would be like on a south-facing wall or in a courtyard, somewhere where it's not getting the extremes of those winter fluctuations. So also numerous small leaves is a way that plants adapt with the reduced leaf surface. This is one of my favorites, this Rosa higonis in the center. So you can see all of those fine leaves. That is and it's Asia, it's native to Asia, but it has that wonderful fine waxy reduced leaf that helps it adapt to these hot, dry climates. The thing that I love about this as well is it is a spring bloomer, and it is that nice simple flower with all those stamens. So it's a great pollinator plant because it blooms in the spring at the optimal time of year, and then it stops flower production through the hottest part of summer. That also makes it adaptable. So then we have this Quercus fusiformis here. This is another one that I truly love. We have these all over the Botanic Garden. They're a great dense shade tree, and they're evergreen as well. And Rhus macrophylla. You guys are all probably familiar with three-leaf sumac. This is its little leaf cousin. I've seen these growing with zero water, and they just look lush and beautiful as can be. That little orange berry you see there is also edible. It's very tart and very high in vitamin C. So my mom, she calls these limita because they used to make like a lemonade drink out of them. And I think that's another advantage to having this in your garden. And then this final kind of super quirky one is the absence of leaves. So on the left, you have green ephedra, in the middle, ocotillo, and then we have this wonderful euphorbia candelaria. Sorry, I'm catching on my L's. I can't roll my L's that well. Anyway, all of these have adapted to have photosynthesis occurring on the leaf stems themselves, or like with the ocotillo, if conditions are optimal, then it will produce leaves and photosynthesize off of those. But if conditions aren't optimal, it drops those leaves and it continues photosynthesizing just through the stems. So the next adaptation that I want to cover is these light-colored or glaucous leaves or silver foliage, which reflect and reduce light absorption. Agave Perry's agave is a prime example of this wonderful, it's like a natural sunscreen basically. One of my favorite plants is this Mojave sage in the middle, that's Salvia pachyphylla. This is a nice kind of 3-foot shrub, very compact. I love it because it can survive on almost no water. It's a wonderful one if you're trying to do like a bigger kind of green mulch. It is evergreen, and you can see those big, beautiful flowers that butterflies and hummingbirds and bees, they all adore them. But once it stops flowering, those pretty little kind of rosy purpley calyxes, those hold their color through the rest of summer. So it is truly a unique ornamental and very much adapted to our climate. It's native to kind of California. So it's kind of, we borrow it, it's regionally native, we'll call it that. And then here on the right is this Artemisia filifolia. I love this one because it's almost like plant poetry. You can see the way that the wind blows, even when the wind is not blowing, because this plant has also adapted to be very supple and soft to kind of deal with the high winds that we can have on the West Mesa. So for me, that's just a winner, just texturally, sustainability, and just the pure poetry of that plant. And then continuing on with light colored and glaucous leaves or silver foliage, you have coyote willow here on the left. So this is one of our native riparian willows. It is a riparian plant. So, you know, if you are lucky to have kind of a low wet spot by the river, this is entirely appropriate for you. Otherwise, just enjoy it in nature. But I do like to show that both the stem and the leaves have that beautiful blue silver coating. Again, Quercus fusiformis, so not only does it have that reduced leaf size, but it also has that light underside to kind of help protect it from the sun. So this is kind of doubling up on those adaptations, if you will. And in the middle, I truly love this one. This is an Ida Red apple, and you can see all of that wonderful light colored foliage on the underside and the new stems. This was actually pointed out to me by Marisa Thompson, who's with the Cooperative Extension, and she was talking about how on fruit trees, you can actually see that kind of powdery sunscreen on the side that faces the sun. And then I took like that little nugget of knowledge and I kind of extrapolated with something that Toru Tanaka had taught me years ago about planting trees. And I had this moment of like, so you can actually like look for this, and it'll show you which direction to plant your tree when you're planting a new tree. and that'll get it acclimated a lot faster than if you're just completely twisting it around from the way that it's been growing in that bucket for so long. So yeah, very cool. And then this Ida Red apple, you're starting to see something else, which brings me to my next adaptation, which is hoary or pubescent leaves. So the great thing about fine hairs on leaves is they deflect heat, wind, and light. They insulate the plant in cold temperatures, which if you look at this Jacob's ladder, which is this little polonium on the left, if you kind of squint very closely, sorry, I took that photo with an iPhone, you can see all the hairs just protecting those flowers. So these alpine plants that grow above tree line, they put a lot into trying to get that flower ready for when that pollinator comes by in that very short growing window between like June and August. Basically, I took this photo at the end of July up at the Continental Divide in Colorado. And as we were up there, and I'm just like gleefully taking photo after photo of alpine plants, all of a sudden my poor sad son goes, "Mom, it's snowing." So you have to understand that in this extreme environment, this little Jacob's ladder has put on a nice fur coat to protect that most precious asset, the flower, in July when it could just have an unexpected snowfall. In the middle is this lady's mantle. And I love this one. This is another one that I love to use as a living mulch because it does create a nice soft carpet ground cover, very drought tolerant, and it naturalizes but isn't aggressive. And those of you who like very tidy lawns, this is a very nice, tidy ground cover. What you see happening there is those little epithelial hairs that create that soft texture. So they're actually capturing that water and they're holding that water. Plants in extreme desert climates will have this as well, so that they can, any sort of moisture that's in the air, they can trap and catch it and harvest it. And so I think that that's really cool about this plant, that it's doing all sorts of things to kind of contribute to its own sustainability. And then on the right, this is one of my favorite plants, the Salvia cameroides. I'm going to trip all over that. It's a blue sage, Texas or Mexican blue sage. And once again, you see those small leaves, you see the gray or blue coloring, and you see the hairy leaves. So this one, it's just a triple winner as far as sustainability. It blooms basically all summer, and you can see by it that salvia characteristic of that flower. It is a great pollinator plant. So some other factors real quick that help with plant adaptation and sustainability are plants that have drought avoidance. So they're dormant during the hottest part of the season, or they have an annual cycle that seeds before it gets hot. Dormancy might include something like this Mariposa lily on the left. Extensive root systems. So they might be shallow and numerous. They might have deep tap roots like this Illinois bundle flower here next to the lily. Or they might have big tubers like a desert 4 o'clock, a mirabilis, or datura also has a big tuber where they're storing that energy for times that they need it. One of our most noxious and invasive plants, the Russian knapweed, has both deep tap roots and shallow and numerous runners, which is why it is so noxiously invasive. So these adaptations can be good, and they can also be very bad, depending on what the plant is, I suppose. Exfoliating bark is another big one. So it shades the trunk, it enhances respiration, and also a factor in our climate and extreme climates is disease and infestation. So it helps shed that as well. And then also an additional physiological response might be plants that can close their stomates during the hottest part of the day or during drought. And then they can cease flowering. So like your tomato plant in your garden, as soon as it gets hot, it's like, I don't want to flower. That's too much work. So it stops that cycle until it cools down. And this will also slow water and nutrient uptake, which is good in the short term. But when we have prolonged drought, ultimately, this can be detrimental. So it's a solution, it's just not the best solution. And this Echinacea purpurea, I always say, it's not a low water plant. I've never seen an Echinacea at the end of the day that looks good. They all look somewhat like this because they're closing those stomates. So don't judge how much water you're giving your plant, if it's the appropriate amount, if it's during the hottest part of the day, because they might be having this response. So instead, look at them in the morning when they've had the chance to open those stomates up and kind of refresh through the night. How do they look in the morning? And that's kind of one of the best ways to indicate, like, are you giving your plant enough water? So once we've gone over all those, you guys are probably thinking, well, like, what about these? I go to the box store and they have this wonderful yew, or they have this maidenhair fern, or they have these echeveria, they're desert succulents. Why don't they live here? A lot of that has to do, I mean, the yew does in full shade, and we have the maidenhair fern and inside our conservatory in a very humid environment. So technically, I guess they could, but it has to do with the cuticle composition. So how thick and waxy it is. And then that might be in relation to moisture content. So like this echeveria right here. So they might have a thinner cuticle and high moisture so that they just can't deal with our winter freezes. Everything turns to ice and the plant rots. Leaf thickness, so both this yew and this fern, they have very fine, thin leaves, so not very resilient in our desert heat or sun or drought. And then the leaf coloration is another indicator. So both this yew and this fern, they tend to be more shade loving. And so you see that kind of light color. It's not quite glaucous like our desert plants, but it's just that kind of light, bright green. That's always a great indicator. It might not be suitable for our desert climate. So these factors, you know, they're things to consider, but you also have to consider the full picture of the plant and not just one or two things. So what I suggest is using regionally appropriate alternatives. For example, this Philadelphus lewisii, this mock orange here, has that big lush leaf and this big showy cluster of flowers. So you know that's probably a high water user. And then we have Microphyllus here, which is native to the Southwest, has a much smaller leaf. When you look at it, it kind of has, you know, pretty obvious stomates, a little bit of hairs even on the leaves, and they're just finer. But it still gets that amazing scent. And it's just still a wonderful desert tolerant shrub, more so than the lewisii. Here's another example of Eastern redbud on the far right, and then this Mexican redbud in the middle. And you can just see the textural difference on that leaf. So the Mexican redbud has that nice thick leaf with the waxy, shiny coating. And then the Eastern redbud says, like, oh my God, desert Southwest sun, you're going to burn me alive. And it does. One of the jokes that we have in horticulture is it's not a red bud, it's a dead bud. And that's usually because it's an Eastern red bud. They can do okay if you put them under shade, but they're just going to need more water than its Mexican counterpart here. Couple more. So again, a Mexican sycamore. Look at that hairy, wonderful glaucous leaf. And then we have London plane tree, which is a hybrid of, I think, Eastern sycamore and a European sycamore. But still, look at that thing. It is thin, it is big, it is lush. And so the other horticultural joke we have with these is they are sycamore. Unless it's a Mexican sycamore, or even sometimes Arizona does pretty well here. They're still riparian plants, so they still need consistent moisture and can't tolerate prolonged drought. But the Mexican and Arizona species will do much better in our environment than this plane tree. And then even just looking at Agastaches, for example, so you have this Phoenicolium, which is this kind of big giant hyssop with that big broad leaf. This plant gets about 4 feet tall. So it is big and it loves water. It needs water to maintain that height and those leaves. And then you have this beautiful, delicate rupestris. So I think with the flowers, it might get 3 feet. So it's a smaller, more compact plant. But then you have that nice needle foliage. You have that glaucous foliage. And then it's really high oil content as well. So that kind of helps you understand that that cuticle is well protected. So now that we've talked about plant adaptations, let's talk about what plants, how they adapt when it concerns pollinators. And so I have a couple of very quick slides to talk about this to kind of segue into my next segment. So here's a relationship between passion flower and the postman butterfly. So they've evolved together. The passion flower relies on the postman for pollination, but what it doesn't want is the postman's caterpillar, which will eat the leaves of the plant. So it's created all of these adaptations through leaf structure and behavior. So the first two slides on the bottom show the different leaf morphologies that it will employ to make the postman feel like it's an ailing plant and not the best candidate to lay its eggs. And then you see kind of the drooping tips. So again, that's this indicator that it's ailing, it might not be around long enough to host your children, so don't bother laying it here. And then you see this leaf structure here with all the little dots. So those are modified glands where it's mimicking eggs, other caterpillar eggs. So then the postman sees it, says, oh, there's competition here. I don't want to put my babies where these babies are because who knows who's going to win. So it picks another site. And then finally, if caterpillar predation continues, it actually secretes a nectar which attracts ants, which are a natural predator of the caterpillar. So it does all of these things in relationship with the postman butterfly in order to attract it as a pollinator, but protect it from larval predation. It's incredible. And then closer to home, we have this example with coyote tobacco. So the very early pollination relies on sphinx moth pollinators. However, once the sphinx moth lay eggs and caterpillars, the hornworm becomes present. It releases a chemical that attracts a hornworm predator. So it's kind of trying to make sure that while it's available for pollination, it's not available for predation, or it's protected against predation. And then once this predation cycle continues, it does a very magical thing in my mind. So it modifies its flower position, shape, and time of flowering. So then instead of being a night pollinator for the sphinx moth, it becomes a day plant for the hummingbird. So it completely modifies its composition based on who's coming through at what time of year to pollinate it. Just incredible opportunism. And that's why we think desert plants are amazing. They're adaptive. They can adapt if we pick the right ones. So how does this relate to what we do with native cultivars? So there's this YouTube video. It's about an hour and 10 minutes. I encourage you to watch it when you have time because it's really interesting, where Professor Ann White at the University of Vermont did an ecological, she was talking about, comparing natives with cultivars. And this is some of the most significant results that she found. So first, she kind of compared like why choose a native species over why choose a cultivar. So cultivars, a lot of times they can be more compact, they're more unique. They select them for disease resistance and they're easier to propagate. Like native plants, like some of you in the audience may know the challenges of germinating native plants from seed. It can be tricky. So if you have cultivars, you can kind of breed this ease into the plant propagation, and it's just an easier game. And you have a more uniform result. Native plants, they can be all over the place. You may not know what you're going to get. Cross-pollination, for example, can do wonderful things to apples and cucumbers and pumpkins for that matter. So your native cultivars, a little more predictable. So that's maybe why landscape companies and homeowners like them. So she studied 16 pairs of native versus their cultivar. Here's kind of the rundown of the ones she studied. The ones that I pulled out that I was most interested in was what happened with the New England aster when you changed it from the blue flower to the red flower. So the blue flower is the native species, the red flower is the hybrid cultivar. So let's talk about the primary pollinator for asters, are bees. And let's look at what bees see. Bee vision is trichromatic, so they really see the blue, the green, and the ultraviolet. So then now let's look at this aster again. And what have we done to that blue? We've turned it red. Oops, sorry, excuse me. Let's look back. So bees can't see red. So we've basically created a plant that the primary pollinator can't see. And then another one that stood out that I really wanted to go over were these echinaceas. And again, we kind of changed the color and the position of the echinaceas. And what we found is the least visited was that pink double delight that has that double flower, which makes sense because double flowers tend to eliminate the pollen producing parts in favor of more petals. So what you're seeing on that is just a bunch of little petals, and you've taken away all of the pollination parts. So there's not a whole lot for the bee to find there. Next was that big sky sunrise because it's yellow. And again, it's slightly out of their range of visibility. So white, also not as great, but then you can see how many pollinators visited the purpurea, which is directly in their color range. And then finally, these lobelias. So the lobelia on the left, the cardinalis, has a high concentration of nectar. And then the lobelia on the right, the blue lobelia, it is actually more pollen, less nectar. Because of the color selection, they've evolved basically for the red one to provide nectar to hummingbirds and the blue one to provide pollen to bees. The natural of order things, right? Well, when you hybridize them, they don't actually turn out the way you think. So let's look again. Hummingbird vision, red and yellow. Bees do not see in that spectrum. And this is an example of what a bee sees when they're looking at a red flower. So when we go back to this, what they found during the hybridization was that fan scarlet, the red hybrid, ended up having low nectar. So it took on the trait of the blue. It didn't actually, because it was red, stay high in nectar. It took on the parent trait of the blue plant. So while the hummingbird could see it, it really didn't offer anything for the hummingbird. So what Anne White suggests is that when you're thinking about cultivars versus native plants, you kind of use a very logical, methodical way to determine if they're okay or not okay. So in highly urban areas, they might be okay, you know, due to the compact size, the predictability, all of that. But as you move further and further away from highly developed areas, even in parks, and then when you get into the rural and then conservation areas, really you move further and further away from using cultivars at all, and you try to source native plants. So for some of you that live close to downtown, maybe cultivars are great. But for some of you who live on the fringes of Albuquerque, bordering the foothills, the mesas, really consider what you're selecting to go in your yards and how that impacts the natural environment. And so this top right slide, I think, is wonderful. So it talks about using the coneflower as an example again. Unmodified is best, highly modified, terrible. And then you get areas of moderation, which are okay. So you just kind of think about that when you're choosing the plants that are going to go into your landscape. And with that, we're on to just a bunch of plant slides. So I hope some of you are still with us. Let's see how we're doing on time. Oh yeah, we're a little bit over. So we'll just kind of go through them real quick. These are some of my favorite plants for our desert landscapes. This is lacebark elm. They're doing a lot now with hybridizing American elms. So most of these elms do not have the same characteristics as a Siberian elm, and they're actually great drought-tolerant street trees. What I love about this one is that beautiful exfoliating bark, which also makes it resistant in our climate, but it's just beautiful in the winter as well. So Texas madrone is one. You know, you didn't really see these in New Mexico at all. They were more closer to like the south and east of here into Texas. But I feel like as our climate is heating up, these are actually becoming more and more suitable for our climate. The one issue with them is they're kind of transplant difficult. And so I think that's one challenge that's going to make it harder to get them into production. But if you do get a chance to find one of these in a native plant nursery, it is a great selection. We've seen wonderful things happening with this plant at the Botanic Garden. These netleaf hackberry is another one. Again, you see that really interesting bark. It has the fruit for the pollinate or for the wildlife support and habitat support. And I've seen these plants growing down in the Oregon mountains in the most driest of climates. So if it can survive there, it's a great selection for here in Albuquerque. And then the oak species. So we talked about these a little more earlier, but I'd also like to point out like a lot of these oak trees have this nice lobed leaf, and that's really actually great for high wind areas because it allows the wind to pass through much easier. So to me, that's another factor which makes them adaptable to our desert climates. And hawthorns. Probably one of my favorite hawthorn is the Russian hawthorn. I planted these in the high desert rose garden. They have a big, beautiful green trunk and these gorgeous berries. That photo in the middle is a photo I took here of our Russian hawthorn and the berries that it has, and they last through winter. So they're great for wildlife. You can eat them. And so they just have year-round interest and they're incredibly drought tolerant. And then screwbean mesquite. That was one of the photos I showed you earlier with the exfoliating bark. So very interesting bark. You get these incredible clusters of flower in the spring and the bees just love them. So it's a great pollinator plant. And then you get these really funky corkscrew bean pods, which wildlife love. And then they hold on to those through winter. So even when they drop all their leaves, they still have this really cool architecture to them. And then for shrubs, Arizona rosewood, it's a wonderful evergreen shrub. It has that nice waxy linear leaf, so it's suitable to our environment. What I don't understand is why people are still planting photinias when they can plant these instead. And then all of our mahonias. I love the mahonias because they bloom very early in spring. You get this wonderful fragrant yellow flower, whether it's the repens, which is a low creeping one, or one of these larger ones like the hematocarpa, the trifoliata, and the fremontii. They're just incredible plants. They're evergreen. And again, you get that evergreen color, the early spring flowers, and then it's just nice, dense, shrubby cover for wildlife as well. So shrubs like this are wonderful because when we get those high cold winds in the winter, this is where all the birds will be sheltering. And then the sumacs. I love three-leaf sumac. I think there's more than enough of it in Albuquerque, and there are all these other wonderful sumacs to consider as well. Microphylla, again, is one of my favorite just because it can survive on zero water. Another one that I truly adore is this ovata, the sugar bush sumac. It's native to California, but it has that big round waxy leaf and it's evergreen, which is wonderful. So again, why are we planting photinia when we have this evergreen alternative instead? And then that top left photo is the flame leaf sumac. I feel like those probably need a little more water than the other two by far, but what's wonderful about those are those big cones of flowers. So not only do the bees love those cones, but this is another one in the late summer when the fig beetles come out, you can just find them buzzing all over this plant. And I love watching children run in terror when the fig beetles are flying over their head, chasing them down the path. It's great. It's a learning moment. And then point leaf manzanita, again, I just love this beautiful winter interest with the bark, that waxy, nice green evergreen leaf. And they're coming up with some really good natural hybrids that have larger leaves and that are more tolerant of our heat as well. And then wolfberries. So one thing that's kind of been on trend for some time is planting Asian goji berries, which is the same family, but these are our native wolfberries. They are edible. They have some of the same characteristics as goji fruit. And what I like about this too, especially for urban environments, is that this plant loves disturbed soils, and you can actually find them growing along ruined walls all over the Southwest. And the wild buckwheats. This is another one that I love to use as a green or living mulch because it is, most of them are these kind of nice low mounding buckwheats. There's so many different species in the Southwest. And what that does is it creates like this habitat connectivity for pollinators so that they can have these like effective migration and foraging patterns as well. And then this is another one that is the poster child for habitat connectivity, is this Thelesperma or green thread. This top right photo is the Megapotamicum, and this grows all over the west side. It just does its own thing. You don't need to seed it. Once it's in, it'll naturalize. It's got this beautiful, they call it the rayless green thread. It also has very fine needle-like leaves, so it's hitting all of those characteristics for sustainability, and it's medicinal, and the pollinators love it. And then these sea hollies. So this Eryngium, it's actually a Mediterranean native, but you would not believe the amount of bees that I see on this plant just when it's in bloom like that. And then our native cousins are this rattlesnake master, this Yuccafolium, which is a plains plant, but it does pretty well in drought conditions. We have some here in very dry areas, and they do fine. And that's a little tarantula hawk wasp, our state insect on top. And then here we have a rare plant, New Mexico rare plant, which is this Arizona orinjo, which this again grows only in very small seep areas on the New Mexico, Arizona, and Mexican border. But this is one of the rare plants that we hope to put in our seed bank soon. And this, hands down, is one of my favorite desert plants, is this Desert 4 o'clock. It blooms in the afternoon, so it's great for the night pollinators. And you can see that like loose, airy growth pattern. So it's another one of the living mulches I love. It has a large tuber, so it can survive quite well in drought conditions. And it allows other plants to kind of grow up through it. So while it can cover a large area, it's not really going to crowd out its companion plants. And we already talked about this one, but here it is again, the Salvia pachyphylla Mojave sage. And then of course the dahlias. So these are all nitrogen fixers. You can get the lowest ground covers. This one little guy in the center that almost looks like alfalfa is the Albuquerque prairie clover. And then you have these other beautiful species versions. You have the Greggii, frutescens, the Scoparia, which you see on the mesa, and the Scariosa, that's the Albuquerque prairie clover. And then, of course, native grasses. You can't have a sustainable habitat without it. They're just wonderful for wildlife habitat. Again, these short bunch grasses like rice grass, blue grama grass, side oats grama, little blue stem. So they're a really great way to use very little water to cool the natural environment down. And then these are some of my favorite. Again, I know I just gave a little talk about cultivars, but anyway, we'll just enjoy these anyway, because these opunches, this walk-in beauty, they come in so many different flower colors. And these were actually hybridized off of an opuntia that was found in, I think it was Utah. The thing I like about them is they don't get too wild with the colors. They're kind of all in that same spectrum of peach, pink, and purple. So while, you know, they are hybrids, they're not genetically modified crazily by horticulturists somewhere. They're just gorgeous to add to the landscape. And then the Silver Anniversary is a hybrid between a Filmentosa and a Pellida. And I think it just has a little more structure than a Pellida. The Filmentosa is kind of soft-leafed. So this one just has a nice architectural look to it. And that's all I have.